Why did the most paranoid perfectionist in cinema history only respect a handful of war films out of thousands? Kubrick spent decades dissecting combat on screen and tore most of it apart as lies dressed up as heroism. He wasn't hunting explosions. He was hunting truth, dread, and the particular madness that turns ordinary men into killers. This list is his verdict, plus one glaring omission we couldn't ignore. Some choices will surprise you. One might make you question everything you thought you knew about war cinema. All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930. Louis Milestone's adaptation of Erich Maria Remarque's novel follows a group of idealistic young German students who enlist in World War I only to discover the trenches strip away every illusion they carried with them. The film refuses heroism at every turn. Soldiers die not in noble last stands, but in mud, confusion, and arbitrary artillery fire, often without even an enemy in sight. Its most haunting sequence, a young soldier reaching for a butterfly moments before being shot, distills the entire film's thesis into a single, devastating image. War ends beauty without ceremony or meaning. Released just 12 years after the armistice, the film carried real cultural weight. Banned in Nazi Germany for its unflinching anti-war stance, years before the next World War began. Its DNA runs straight through Paths of Glory's trench warfare and Full Metal Jacket's dehumanization arc. If Kubrick's list has an unspoken ancestor, this silent-era masterpiece, loud in its grief, is almost certainly it. Platoon, 1986. Oliver Stone didn't direct this one from research. He lived it, and you can feel the difference in every frame. Kubrick respected few directors who tried to capture Vietnam, but Stone's first-hand experience as an infantryman gave the film a texture that researched scripts couldn't fake. The exhaustion, the paranoia, the way morality dissolves in jungle heat. The story follows a young recruit caught between two sergeants, one decent, one consumed by darkness, and the battle becomes less about the enemy outside and more about which version of humanity survives inside the unit. Charlie Sheen's narration carries a weary innocence that curdles scene by scene. What likely earned Kubrick's respect wasn't the combat choreography, impressive as it was, but the moral rot the film refuses to sanitize. There's no glory here, no clean lines between good and evil, just men breaking under pressure and dragging each other down with them. It won Best Picture, but accolades weren't Kubrick's currency. Authenticity was, and Stone, having actually carried a rifle through that war, delivered something most directors could only imitate from a safe distance. The Battle of Algiers, 1966. Shot like a documentary, because Gillo Pontecorvo wanted you to forget you were watching fiction at all. Grainy, handheld, unbearably close. This Italian-Algerian production reconstructs the brutal urban guerrilla war between French colonial forces and Algerian insurgents fighting for independence, and it refuses to flatter either side. Torture is shown plainly. Bombings targeting civilians are shown plainly. The film forces you to sit with the uncomfortable mechanics of asymmetric warfare, rather than rooting for a hero. That moral ambiguity is almost certainly what pulled Kubrick toward it. He distrusted films that made war legible as a simple contest between right and wrong. Pontecorvo used non-professional actors and real locations, blurring the line between archive footage and staged scenes so completely that the film was reportedly studied by military strategists decades later, including reportedly by the Pentagon, for its insight into insurgent tactics. It's less a war movie than a dissection of power, resistance, and the cost both sides pay to win. For a director obsessed with dehumanization and systems of control, Algiers wasn't entertainment, it was a case study. Paths of Glory, 1957. Paths of Glory is not just a war film Kubrick respected, it is one he built himself, and it remains one of the clearest statements of his entire career. Set during World War I, the story follows Colonel Dax, played with controlled fury by Kirk Douglas, as he defends 3 French soldiers chosen as scapegoats after a disastrous assault their commanders knew was almost impossible to win. Kubrick strips away every comforting illusion normally attached to battlefield courage. The trenches are muddy, narrow, and terrifying, but the real violence comes after the guns stop. Inside the courtroom, justice becomes performance, discipline becomes cruelty, and the lives of ordinary men are sacrificed to protect the reputation of generals sitting safely far from the front. That is why the film still feels so sharp. It does not treat war as a contest between nations. It treats war as a machine.
How far would you say that was? How many meters? Well,
one that consumes the powerless to preserve the pride of those in command. The tracking shots through the trenches are famous for their precision, but the emotional blow comes from the film's moral clarity. Kubrick exposes how quickly honor can become a costume worn by cowards with authority. The film was reportedly controversial for its attack on military injustice, and that only adds to its force. Paths of Glory shows that in war, the enemy is not always across the battlefield. Sometimes he is wearing your own uniform, giving orders from above. That bitterness is why it still feels less like history than a warning about power protecting itself at any cost. Full Metal Jacket, 1987. Full Metal Jacket is Kubrick's final direct confrontation with war, and it refuses to behave like a normal Vietnam movie. The film is split almost violently in two, first trapping viewers inside the brutal world of Paris Island boot camp, then dropping them into the shattered streets of Hue during the Tet Offensive. That division is not a weakness. It is the entire argument. Kubrick shows that soldiers are not simply thrown into war, they are manufactured for it. The first half watches young recruits stripped of identity, mocked, punished, reshaped, and humiliated until violence becomes part of their language. R. Lee Ermey's drill instructor is terrifying because he represents an institution speaking through one human body, turning cruelty into training and obedience into survival. By the time the Marines reach Vietnam, the psychological damage has already been done. The combat scenes are chaotic and frightening, but they feel like the result of something that began much earlier, back in the barracks. Kubrick is less interested in battlefield glory than in the process that teaches ordinary men to laugh at death, dehumanize enemies, and split themselves apart to keep functioning. The film's coldness is often misunderstood, but that distance is what makes it so disturbing.
Siper alın çocuklar, hadi.
Full Metal Jacket does not offer catharsis, heroism, or easy mourning. It shows war as a system that begins before the first shot is fired and continues long after the last body falls silent. Its final image lingers, because the surviving men sound less victorious than emptied, marching forward with innocence already burned away inside. Dr. Strangelove, 1964. Dr. Strangelove is one of the most frightening war films ever made because it makes the end of the world feel ridiculous, procedural, and almost casual. Kubrick began with the possibility of a serious nuclear thriller, but the deeper he studied Cold War logic, the more absurd the entire system appeared. The result is a pitch-black comedy about men calmly discussing mass extinction through phone calls, charts, protocols, and wounded egos. The plot begins when a deranged American general launches an unauthorized nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, forcing politicians and military officials into a desperate attempt to stop a catastrophe they helped make possible. Peter Sellers gives 3 brilliant performances, but the title character remains the darkest joke, a former Nazi scientist folded neatly into respectable Western power, his body betraying the horrors everyone pretends have been buried. What makes the film so devastating is not that its leaders are cartoonishly evil. It is that they are vain, confused, rigid, sexually insecure, and completely trusted with machines capable of ending civilization.
Progress delay factor yellow 3.
Bomb fusing circuits 1 through 4 test.
Kubrick understood that modern war no longer required courage, battlefield honor, or even hatred. It could be triggered by systems, assumptions, and men too proud to admit they had built something insane. The laughter in Dr. Strangelove is not relief. It is panic wearing a smile. Few films have made military power look so childish, so mechanical, and so terrifyingly close to reality at the same time. That is why the comedy lands like prophecy, not parody, especially whenever real politics starts sounding just as deranged again today. Alexander Nevsky, 1938. Alexander Nevsky earns its place because it treats war as movement, rhythm, fear, propaganda, and spectacle all at once. Directed by Sergei Eisenstein, the film tells the story of Prince Alexander defending medieval Russia from invading Teutonic Knights. But its real power is not only in the history. It is in the way Eisenstein turns battle into pure cinema. Every face, shield, helmet, horse, and marching line feels arranged with terrifying precision. This is exactly the kind of control Kubrick would have respected. The film does not simply show armies fighting. It shows how nations manufacture heroes, how enemies are turned into symbols, and how violence becomes a public myth before it becomes a private wound. The legendary Battle on the Ice remains one of the most unforgettable war sequences ever filmed, not because it looks modern, but because it feels elemental. Soldiers crash against each other like machines. The frozen landscape becomes a trap. Sergei Prokofiev's music does not merely support the images, it seems to command them, pushing the battle forward with almost ritual force. What makes Alexander Nevsky so valuable for this list is that it understands war as both physical conflict and theatrical construction. It is patriotic, yes, but also cold, formal, and disturbing in its beauty. For Kubrick, who spent his career studying power, ceremony, discipline, and human bodies trapped inside systems, this film would not have felt old. It would have felt like a blueprint. The 317th Platoon, 1965. The 317th Platoon is one of the great films about defeat, and that is what makes it so powerful. Pierre Schoendorfer sets the story during the final days of the First Indochina War, following a small French platoon retreating through the Laotian jungle while Viet Minh forces close in around them. The commander is young and inexperienced, but command arrives whether he is ready or not. Around him are exhausted soldiers, colonial illusions collapsing, and a landscape that seems to swallow every plan men try to impose on it. Schoendorfer had lived through this world himself. He was captured at Dien Bien Phu, and that first-hand knowledge gives the film a harsh authority. Nothing feels decorative. The jungle is not exotic scenery. It is pressure, confusion, hunger, mud, and fear. The men are not fighting for glory anymore. They are trying to survive a war already lost. That refusal to turn military failure into heroic myth is exactly why the film fits Kubrick's worldview. Kubrick was drawn to stories where institutions fail the people inside them, and the 317th Platoon is full of that bleak understanding. Strategy has collapsed. Ideology has collapsed. What remains is endurance, discipline, and the quiet terror of knowing that every step backward may still not be enough. The film is stripped down, unsentimental, and deeply human. It shows war not as triumph, but as retreat, through a world where history has already decided the outcome. That honesty gives the film a bitter dignity, because survival itself becomes the only victory left to believe in anymore. Dien Bien Phu, 1992. Dien Bien Phu feels like Pierre Schoendorfer returning to the wound that shaped his life. Decades after serving in Indochina and being captured during the famous battle, he reconstructed the catastrophic siege that ended French colonial power in the region. The film is larger and more ambitious than the 317th Platoon, but it carries the same refusal to romanticize war. This is not a story about noble defeat polished into legend. It is about artillery, isolation, exhausted soldiers, collapsing strategy, and the slow realization that a military position has become a trap. Schoendorfer approaches the battle with the authority of memory, but also with enough distance to see the wider historical machinery at work. The French are not portrayed as simple heroes, and the Viet Minh are not reduced to faceless enemies. The film understands that history is made through suffering on all sides. even when one side's political cause is collapsing. Kubrick's interest in Schondorfer makes sense, because no other filmmaker on this list carried quite the same direct relationship to Indochina. He did not imagine that war from research alone. He survived it, remembered it, and returned to it again and again. Dien Bien Phu is the final reckoning, the large-scale account of a defeat that changed empires. Its power lies in the way it treats war as both personal memory and historical event, where individual fear and geopolitical collapse become impossible to separate. That is why it feels less like recreation than testimony. Built by someone still listening to echoes from the battlefield, he never escaped completely. Apocalypse Now, 1979. Apocalypse Now is less a conventional Vietnam film than a nightmare drifting upriver. Francis Ford Coppola sends Captain Willard into the jungle to find Colonel Kurtz, a renegade officer who has built his own kingdom of madness beyond the reach of ordinary command. The journey begins as a military mission, but every mile strips away another layer of reason until the war itself starts to feel like a fever dream, built from music, fire, helicopters, drugs, fear, and myth. The production became nearly as legendary as the film. Storms destroyed sets. Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack, Marlon Brando arrived unprepared, and Coppola nearly lost control of everything. Somehow that chaos became part of the movie's force. Apocalypse Now feels unstable, because the world it shows is unstable. The helicopter assault remains one of cinema's most famous war sequences because it is both thrilling and horrifying, a display of power so beautifully staged that the beauty becomes part of the accusation. Kubrick reportedly admired the film's ambition, and it is easy to see why. Like his own work, it refuses clean morality. There is no simple lesson, no innocent authority, no battlefield that explains itself. Kurtz is monstrous, but the system that created him is monstrous too. Apocalypse Now turns war into psychological dissent, showing civilization not as a shield against savagery, but as one of the masks savagery wears when given orders. Its greatness is that it never lets the viewer stand outside the madness. It pulls everyone into the current and keeps drifting toward darkness, without rescue anywhere. The Deer Hunter, 1978. The Deer Hunter is a war film that spends much of its power outside the battlefield. Michael Cimino begins in a Pennsylvania steel town, letting viewers sit with weddings, friendships, drinking, work, rituals, and ordinary masculine tenderness before Vietnam tears everything apart. That long opening is essential because the film is not simply asking what war does to soldiers. It is asking what war does to a community that sends its young men away and receives strangers in return. Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and John Savage play friends whose lives are permanently fractured by captivity, violence, and trauma. The controversial Russian roulette sequences are not documentary realism, but symbolic horror, a brutal image of chance, fear, and psychological destruction. Whether historically accurate or not, they became the film's central metaphor for men forced to gamble with their own souls. Kubrick's respect for the film likely came from its seriousness about aftermath. The war does not end when the characters leave Vietnam. It follows them home in silence, in broken gestures, in rooms where people no longer know how to speak to one another. The Deer Hunter understands that damage can be invisible and still total. Its most painful moments are often quiet. A blank stare, a failed reunion, a song sung with too much sorrow behind it. This is war as emotional contamination, spreading through memory, friendship, family, and place. The battlefield is only the beginning. The real devastation is what survives after it. That is why its grief feels so enormous. It belongs to everyone left behind, too. Tora, 1970. Tora stands out because it treats Pearl Harbor less like a patriotic myth and more like a vast procedural tragedy. Instead of reducing history to heroes and villains, the film reconstructs the attack from both American and Japanese perspectives, following intelligence failures, diplomatic delays, military planning, missed warnings, and fatal assumptions on both sides. That even-handed structure is what gives the film its unusual force. The Japanese commanders are shown as strategic professionals, not cartoon enemies, while the American side is not idealized into perfect innocence. The catastrophe emerges through systems failing in layers, messages unread, warnings dismissed, officials distracted, and institutions unable to respond quickly enough to the danger forming in front of them. That is exactly the kind of subject Kubrick understood. He was fascinated by disaster created not by one evil genius, but by procedure, ego, blindness, and bureaucracy working together. The production itself aimed for authenticity, using practical effects, large-scale staging, and careful reconstruction rather than turning the attack into simple adventure. When the planes finally arrive over Pearl Harbor, the spectacle is impressive, but it feels earned by everything that came before. The slow, almost unbearable accumulation of preventable mistakes. Tora is not the most emotional war film on this list, but its restraint is its strength. It shows history as machinery, and catastrophe as the moment when too many small failures become one enormous, irreversible disaster. Its coldness makes the impact stronger, because it refuses comfort and forces blame to spread across an entire system instead of one villain alone. Spartacus, 1960. Kubrick directed Spartacus II, but unlike nearly every film that followed, this was not fully his kingdom. He was brought in after Anthony Mann was fired only days into production, and the project remained heavily shaped by Kirk Douglas, the studio, and a massive historical canvas already in motion. Yet the film still belongs on this list, because its war is not just spectacle. It is rebellion. Douglas plays Spartacus, the enslaved gladiator who rises against the Roman Republic and turns personal survival into a political uprising. The battles are huge, but the real force of the film comes from its anger at systems that grind human beings into property, entertainment, and disposable bodies. The famous "I am Spartacus" scene still lands because it turns defeat into solidarity. One by one, condemned rebels claim his name, not because they expect rescue, but because they refuse to let Rome own the final meaning of their sacrifice. The production also carried weight beyond the screen. Dalton Trumbo, blacklisted for years, received open-screen credit, making the film a quiet act of defiance inside Hollywood itself. Kubrick later remained uneasy about how much of Spartacus truly reflected his vision, but its power is hard to dismiss. An epic where war is not noble adventure, but the terrible price of refusing to live on your knees. It is less about victory than resistance, less about conquest than dignity. And that moral anger keeps the film alive long after the swords stop clashing against every empire demanding absolute obedience forever. Barry Lyndon, 1975. Barry Lyndon is not usually treated as a traditional war film, and that is exactly why it feels so Kubrickian. The war does not arrive as heroic destiny. It arrives as an institution, cold and beautifully organized, swallowing ordinary men inside uniforms, rituals, and rules they barely understand. The story follows an Irish opportunist trying to climb through 18th-century European society, but the 7 Years' War becomes one of the forces that exposes how little control he truly has over his own life. Kubrick stages combat with painterly distance rather than excitement. Soldiers march forward in rigid formation, almost politely, into musket fire. Death feels procedural, not glorious. No one is framed as a mythic warrior. They are figures inside a vast historical machine. The film's famous candlelit interiors, achieved with specially modified lenses, create the feeling of old paintings brought to life, but that beauty only makes the cruelty feel more chilling. Everything in Barry Lyndon is arranged: marriages, duels, inheritances, manners, and war itself. Combat becomes another social mechanism.
Graham?
Yes, my lord. As soon as we arrive at Castle Hacked.
As empty and merciless as the class system surrounding it, Barry is not transformed into a hero by battle. He survives, adapts, and drifts, shaped by forces larger than his ambition. That may be the film's sharpest anti-war idea. Kubrick drains conflict of romance completely, showing war as one more elegant structure built to erase individual suffering. Its calmness is what makes it disturbing, because the violence seems accepted, polished, and almost invisible. Order itself becomes the battlefield, beautiful, absurd, and deadly quietly. Hell's Angels, 1930. Hell's Angels is the kind of war film that could only have come from Hollywood's most reckless early age. Howard Hughes did not simply want to suggest World War I aerial combat. He wanted to capture the terror of it, so he gathered real planes, real pilots, and staged dogfights on a scale that still feels unnervingly physical. The result is not polished in the modern sense, but it has a dangerous authenticity that computer effects can rarely imitate. The story follows two brothers pulled into war, rivalry, romance, and sacrifice. Yet the plot is almost overwhelmed by the aerial sequences themselves. Planes dive through clouds, formations scatter, machines burn, and the sky becomes a battlefield with no safety net. The production became infamous for Hughes's obsessive perfectionism and the real risks taken to achieve images audiences had never seen before. That obsession may explain why Kubrick valued it. Hell's Angels is not subtle, and it is not flawless, but it represents a kind of cinematic madness Kubrick understood deeply. The belief that realism must be engineered, controlled, and sometimes chased at terrifying cost. Long before modern war films made authenticity a selling point, Hughes pushed cinema into the air and forced viewers to feel the danger of combat as spectacle, accident, and human gamble. Its place here comes from that raw ambition, the sense that war on screen should never feel safe, clean, or easily manufactured.
Pretty well fed up with me after all this.
Oh, that's rot.
It feels primitive, excessive, and astonishingly alive, like early cinema testing how far danger could go on screen. Henry V, 1944. Henry V stands apart because it is not just a war film about the past. It is a wartime film speaking directly to the present tense of 1944. Laurence Olivier directed and starred while Britain was still living under the shadow of World War II, and the story of an outnumbered English army facing a powerful enemy carried obvious emotional force for contemporary audiences. The Battle of Agincourt becomes more than a historical set piece. It becomes a national dream of courage under impossible pressure. Olivier's famous St. Crispin's Day speech is the heart of the film because the words do what armies alone cannot. They transform fear into purpose, men into brothers, and likely defeat into shared destiny. For Kubrick, who spent so much of his career questioning institutions, command structures, and the language used to justify violence, Henry V offers a fascinating exception. Here, rhetoric is not merely propaganda or manipulation. It becomes a force that binds people together in the face of annihilation. The film's theatrical color, stylized settings, and sweeping battlefield movement make Shakespeare feel urgent rather than dusty, as if the old text has been rearmed for a nation trying to survive.
Why? And of all other men.
Its greatness lies in that tension. Henry V understands the horror of war, but it also believes in morale, leadership, and conviction. In Kubrick's darker universe, that kind of sincerity was rare, which may be exactly why this film stood out. It turns battle into language, and language into a weapon of survival when nations tremble. 16 films, 3 by the same haunted French soldier-turned-director, one made by Kubrick himself, twice. One so essential, we added it ourselves. What connects them isn't spectacle, it's honesty about what war actually does to the human mind. No glory, no easy heroes, just the unbearable weight of decisions made by ordinary, broken people. Which of these have you actually seen? Comment below. The list might surprise you.